Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday. Although it is April Fool's Day, welcome. This is everyone's from Anton. Welcome to my weekly broadcast of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. April Fool's, 1st of April. Um, I'm just, let's just have some fun here. Type it in the comment section. What is the most memorable April Fool's experience you've had? I mean, I didn't even know that April Fools existed until I moved to North America and people started talking about it. Um, I had one. Just so we can break the ice before we get started. The announcement for SQL Server on Linux was made on 1st of April, and everybody thought it was an April Fool's joke because back in 2005 or 2007 timeframe, somebody wrote a blog post on SQL Server Central about running SQL Server on Linux. And of course, back then, Microsoft was all Windows. There was no talks about open source platforms. So it really was an April Fool's joke back then. And what's funny was that when Microsoft announced SQL Server on Linux, they did that on 1st of April. And so, if you're not an insider, you might start to think, oh, it's just like an April Fool's joke from way back when. No, this one's different. And the reason I remember that was because when I was writing my book, the SQL Server DBAs Guide to Docker Containers, I went back into the history of how Microsoft made that announcement to run SQL Server on Linux, and they did it on the 1st of April, which is kind of weird. I don't know why they did that, but maybe it's a marketing ploy to get people to talk about it. Anyway, today's topic, I just want to get that out of the way. If you have any specific April Fool's experience, maybe it's a practical joke or anything, something that you remember, post it in the comments. And I see some people joining in. Welcome. Hi. Today's topic, and hopefully I get the banner to show up without shaking. My camera stand is a little bit shaky. There you are. There you go. So the topic I want to talk about today is the 3 biggest mistakes that DBAs make when deploying and managing SQL Server Always On. Forget about whether it's an Always On availability or available clustered instance. It doesn't really matter. Anything SQL Server high availability, although Microsoft has been really pushing on the Always On platform, be it an Always On availability or Always On available clustered instances. And the one thing that I really appreciate and something that I'm really, really grateful for is having that front row seat to what is going on with client environments, customer environments, as they deal with challenges that have something to do with always on availability groups. And, if it's a one-time thing, it could be an outlier. But when you start to see patterns, when you start to see trends, it becomes something that is pretty common. And it doesn't matter if it's a small organization with maybe a handful of SQL Server instances and they only have like 1 or 2 SQL always on availability groups, or it's an enterprise environment where you got hundreds and hundreds of SQL Server instances, maybe tens of availabilities. This pattern of making these big mistakes have become, I want to say, something that I became so aware of, maybe because when I made these mistakes back then. And there are a couple of instances when I fell into the same mistakes. I made them, and it took a while for me to finally realize I should not be doing these. If my goal is to be able to design, implement, and manage a SQL Server high availability solution. And that's why I really want to talk about these, because again, if you're not aware of these mistakes, you will fall into the trap of making them over and over and over again. And in my case, what really got me to think about this was there was one incident where there was an outage, and I was part of the team that had to bring the high availability solution online. And it dawned on me how everybody in the room was behaving like this and they're making these same mistakes. And I was a part of that. And, after the incident, we did an RCA. We had a meeting about what exactly happened, and the director of the team or the business unit was really smart enough to ask really meaningful questions who got us to really think about why it happened, how can we prevent that from happening in the future, while at the same time reevaluating ourselves. And these are the things that that really stand up for me, or yeah, stand out for me, is understanding how we are behaving as tech professionals, because we will fall into these three big mistakes that I've seen out in the field and I myself have made in the past. And if you got, hopefully you got a pen and paper ready, take notes. I actually encourage people to watch the recording immediately after the live stream, so you can go back, watch it over and over again, take as much notes as you possibly can, because sometimes working with your own siloed environment makes it difficult for you to see the patterns that are happening, and you think, oh, we're just different, not realizing that a lot of people out there, a lot of DBAs and sysadmins who are taking care of high availability solutions are also making these same mistakes. So make sure that you have your pen and paper ready. Write this down. The three biggest mistakes that DBAs make, or sysadmins, if you're taking care of high availability solutions, when you are deploying and managing a SQL Server Always On or SQL Server High Availability solution. First one is that they are trying to do everything on their own. And I remember when I was working as an operational DBA, my team lead emphasized this: do not try to do everything on your own. And it's easy to fall into this trap because, for one, as tech professionals, we want to showcase our expertise. We want to showcase our skill set. We want to make sure that when we take on something, we see it through from start to finish. And so we fall into this trap of trying to do everything on our own. And I kind of emphasized this in some of my previous videos, that a high availability solution is not a one-man sport. Whether you're deploying it or you're managing it, it's not a one-man sport. I mean, think about this for a second. You want to deploy a high availability solution that is available 24/7, and you expect to be the only person taking care of this? Come on, you're going to sleep. You're going to go on vacation. You are going to relax at some point. And what would happen if there was an issue, maybe an outage, and you weren't there? This in itself opens up a lot of challenges, especially if you're the only person taking care of the infrastructure. And I can totally understand that, especially during deployments, right? If you're the lead engineer responsible for designing and deploying this, you take it upon yourself and take ownership of all of the responsibilities. Maybe it's pride, or maybe it's just you. You want to take full responsibility, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? You want to be fully accountable. You want to be totally responsible for the design, the implementation, up until it's ready to cut over. You hand it off to operations. But the thing about this is that when you are too close, to the project, it is very easy to miss some of the critical config because you're just too close to the project. In some cases, we feel, as an engineer or as a DA or sysadmin, we feel that if we allow somebody else to review the config, the environment, is that we are being vulnerable. We are exposing ourselves to someone else's critique, to someone else's opinion. And that's one of my pitfalls back then. I would build something, I would design something, I would roll it out in production, everything that I would do everything from start to finish. And I don't want anybody to review the infrastructure. Why? Because, if he finds just one thing that I did not do, it's kind of like a stab in my reputation. It's kind of like something that I miss. And this is something that a lot of tech professionals fall into. It's more than just taking responsibility for the actions, but it's also being scared of criticisms from other tech professionals, especially when you start to think about an always on availability group or an always on available cluster instance. We're talking about stuff outside of SQL Server. We're talking about Active Directory. We're talking about DNS. We're talking about networking. In some cases, we're talking about storage. And all of these are outside the scope of what a typical DBA would be in charge of. So if you haven't really thought of some of the Active Directory, some of the Active Directory requirements, and you don't even spend a minute a day looking at Active Directory, you start to think about, hey, what if my Active Directory guys start commenting on how I did things, like kernels, for instance? I might appear like an incompetent DBA for not being able to do this, right? Same thing with networking. And again, when we take every responsibility as our own, when we try to do everything on our own, it's very easy to put on blinders and not care about, what the Active Directory expert would say or the networking expert would say. We'll just do what needs to be done. And like I said, HA is a team sport. Even if you can do everything from Active Directory, DNS, networking, and a failover cluster, the operating system, the storage, up until the SQL Server Always On availability or the failover cluster instance, it doesn't make sense to do everything on your own. Why? Because this becomes the start of an overwhelming workload. I mean, come to think about it, your plate is already full as a DBA. You got, the day-to-day operations to think about, and now you're taking care of this project to deploy everything. And now you're taking on more responsibilities, you're taking in more work, which leads to exhaustion. You now have to take care of all these things. Even if, like I said, even if you have the right permissions, hopefully you're not being given domain admin privileges. Even if you have local sysadmin privileges, even if you have all these privileges to do everything on your own from start to finish, it's a recipe for exhaustion. And you know how it is when you're tired and exhausted, it is very difficult to think straight. And in some cases, even when you're too tired, this is when you start to make mistakes. I mean, I'm pretty sure you remember the time when you were woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, there was an issue, you got paid, you have to address a ticket. What used to take about 5 minutes took you about 45 minutes. And that's because your body is still trying to wake up, as being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it is going to take longer to finish something or to complete a task because you're tired and exhausted. And it's the same thing. When you're trying to do everything yourself, whether it's for deploying a high availability solution or even managing a high availability solution. Let's say, for instance, you had some issues with your ghost cleanup process on a primary, and you're trying to do the troubleshooting and not realizing that this is more than just a SQL Server problem, and you're trying to fix everything on your own, right? This is one of the biggest mistakes that DBAs, sysadmins, or anybody taking care of SQL Server Always On fall into. And again, I speak of dozens of experiences where I myself have fallen into this trap. And of course, I pay for the consequences of being so overworked to a point where I may be the subject matter expert on the topic, but when you're really tired and exhausted, you can't really do much, right? So that's the first biggest mistake. You're trying to do everything, or we are trying to do everything on our own, by ourselves. And so we end up becoming so focused, so blindsided on some of the config, the critical config that could have been resolved by through the design process and implementation, rather than causing some issues down the road. So that's the first one, right? The second mistake that DBAs make when they're deploying availability groups or even managing availability groups is they're not being clear on what the real goals are. And this is huge, okay? Let me repeat that. They're not being clear on what the real goals are. There's a big difference between what the business goals are and what the technical goals are. And most of the time, as technical professionals, we kind of gravitate towards the technical goals. Oh, we want to spin up a failover cluster. We want to spin up a high availability solution. We'll be doing this version of SQL, this version of Windows, this edition of SQL, this edition of Windows, 4 nodes, 4 replicas. And we are so fixated on the technical implementation of a particular solution without really taking a step back and asking the question, what are we trying to accomplish here? Because here's what I believe in. Every technical solution needs to address a business problem. If a technical solution does not solve a business problem, it ends up becoming technical debt. And what I mean by that is in future, just maintaining it, you put in a ton of work, a ton of effort. And again, I used to be like this in the past where I would focus on this is the technology, this is the design, this is how we want to do it without really understanding what's the business goal that we are trying to accomplish. Every time I get into conversations with clients and customers, these are questions that I always ask. What's your recovery objective? Meaning recovery point, recovery time objective, because this should be the foundation of where the conversation should start. It's not about the version of Windows, the version of SQL Server, how many nodes, how many replicas, are they just within the same data center, or are they stretched across different data centers? And what about distributed availability groups, or what about other options? Before we even get into the technical details, we have to be crystal clear as to what the problem we're trying to solve is. Why is that? Well, here's the thing. Because we're not clear on the business problems that we're trying to solve, or because we're not really clear on the business goals, we end up deploying complex solutions, really complex solutions that are very challenging to manage. This reminds me of somebody who was in one of my my presentations at a conference a couple of years ago, and he went up to me and started asking questions about how do we go about migrating a 28 node Windows Server failover cluster with failover clustered instances across all of the nodes to a new data center. And I was kind of taken back because, for one, I need to understand, why did they build a 28 node Windows Server failover cluster in the first place? And so I asked that question, and I think he was kind of expecting a technical response because he asked a technical question. And when I asked the question, so why do you have a 28 node failover cluster in the first place? He couldn't find the real reason. And this is the thing, because we're so close, we are too close to the technical implementations, we don't bother asking, what are we really trying to solve here? Why do we have a failover cluster in the first place? Why do we have an availability group in the first place? Why do we have a failover clustered instance? Why do we need HA? And it's easy to simply deploy a solution if our goal is simply to deploy the solution. But understand this, unless a technical solution solves a business problem, it doesn't really matter. And it's this conversation around which one is a better technology. Is it Windows? Is it open source? It's not that. It's really all about what are we trying to solve here. Okay? So if you end up not getting clear, not being crystal clear on what the business goals are, not technical goals, okay, not technical goals, you end up deploying solutions that are so complex that they're very challenging to manage. I've seen cases where an availability group that has 3 replicas in one data center, another replica in another data center, and because of the way the networking was configured, the replicas were configured, only one person knows how to manage it. And like what I said in the first point, that when you're trying to do everything on your own, it's a recipe for stress and overwork. And in this case, if it's so complex, how many people on your team could actually support this other than you? How many people on other teams could be your backup? Like I said, you need to go on vacation. You need to go on weekends. You need to sleep. You need to relax. But if you're the only person who's taking care of this thing and you're the only person who understands this, a lot of technical professionals think, oh, it's job security. Sure, I'm the only person who knows about this, and it's kind of like a job security for me, so I'm not going to let other people know. But the thing is, it's like tying yourself to this infrastructure because you cannot go anywhere. You need to carry your phone with you. You need to always be on call because nobody else knows how to manage it, right? So that's that. It's deploying a complex solution that only you can manage and becomes an administrative nightmare, right? A side effect of that is you end up wasting a ton of time and resources doing repetitive work. In some cases, especially when the time comes for annual reviews, you kind of have a checklist of these are the things that I've accomplished. Sure, but what if we could have avoided doing these in the first place and doing more productive work? I kind of look at this, and I'll just use a very simple example. Um, Monitoring for disk space, and you're always cleaning up your disk subsystem because it's filling up every 2 days, and you end up wasting time doing repetitive work instead of really focusing on the things that really matter. And of course, when that happens, you end up becoming so frustrated with let me drop this for a while. Want to do the work, right? So that's the second thing. Not being clear on the business goals and focusing more. The third thing, focusing more and emphasizing more on the tech or on the technology. Um, I couldn't count a number of times when either the lead DBA or the lead engineer would ask questions about, is this the right approach? Let's say, for instance, they want to deploy, and I was talking to a client the previous day about them moving to Azure. They're replacing their entire always on available infrastructure and moving to Azure managed instances. And the question always has been, how do we do this? They're so focused on the tech that they forget there is more beyond tech. And the thing is you get so fixated, just like what I mentioned in point number 2, where you end up creating solutions that are so complex that only you know how to manage, only you know how to resolve in case something happens. And in the same way, when you're so fixated on tech, you get so narrow-minded on the solution that you think will solve the problem, which of course we're not really clear of, and you kind of ignore some of the possibilities of solutions that you've not explored because all you think about is we want an aging. And in I don't want to say in some, mostly majority of the time when I would ask customers, why do you need an availability group for, or why do you need available clustered instance for? Oftentimes the response is, we just need it. Until I ask I call it the 5 why questions, asking why and then why, until we get down to the real reason why they're deploying an availability group or available clustered instance or any type of high availability solution. And that is when we start getting clear that, you know what, we can actually address this problem without the complexities of an availability group, without the complexities of available clustered instance. Now, in some cases, of course, when it's already there and your responsibility is to take care of a high availability solution, you can't really just say, let's throw this away, let's re-architect, because that is going to get a lot of pushbacks from the people who made the decisions in the first place, right? But when you are so focused on tech, you're trying to limit your options to just doing tech work. And all you could think about is finding a tech solution to a tech problem when it could have been prevented with some process improvements. I remember there was one guy, he was the manager of this large team. Well, not really the manager, he's second in command. And they're doing the migration. And in the process of doing the migration, they made mistakes and it caused them a couple of hours of outage on the production. They didn't even touch the production environment. It just so happened there was some misconfiguration. And what they're trying to do in the next round, if they really wanted to do this and they're cutting short on time, is that they reevaluated all of the steps. And I kind of asked the question, what are you trying to accomplish here? Like, the second point, not being clear on what the real goals are. He said, well, we just want to cut over to this new environment, and we want to do both an upgrade and a migration project. And, ironically, is they have a high availability solution, but because of a misconfiguration on the new environment, it took down their old environment and caused an outage for hours. And for them, that's kind of like, okay, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And because they were so fixated on this is the approach that we're going to do, they were looking at all the different ways that they could make the technology work for them instead of taking a step back and really evaluate what are we trying to accomplish here? What is the goal that we are trying to achieve? Again, going back to the second point that I mentioned earlier, the goal has to connect to the business goal, not deploying a new availability group, not deploying a new available clustered instance, and we're going to be using distributed availability group to migrate everything. No, it has to connect to the real business need, not the technology. Because the technology, you can use other technologies to achieve the same goal. It's kind of like, somebody wants a sports car. Why would you want a sports car? Well, is it because it's fancy to drive a sports car, or is it because you just need something to go to work every day? Well, a Prius would do that. But in most cases, we're so fixated on the means instead of being clear on the goal. And that's why we fixate on the technology. We focus and put so much emphasis on the technology that we end up sidestepping a potential process improvement. We ignore the fact that there is more than one way to solve this problem, and it could be something else other than providing a tech solution to the problem. I can count the number of times when a tech problem has been solved because we made process improvements. And that's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of really identifying what the processes are, what the real requirements are. Because by doing so, you are solving both the tech problem, the process problem, and you are contributing to the benefit of the business or the company that you're working for. Now, these three biggest mistakes that I've seen are, again, these are kind of like common across the board, whether it's a small environment with a handful of SQL Server instances and a handful of availability group solutions, or large enterprises where you have hundreds of SQL Server instances and more than tens or dozens of high availability solutions. How do you address these? How do you address these, and how do you avoid making these mistakes? The first one is to be really, really clear on what the business goals are. It is tempting to say, or it is tempting to just focus on the tech. You say your manager tells you, or your team lead tells you, let's deploy an availability group. It's tempting to start doing the research, understand what availability groups are, trying to deploy it, designing it. It's tempting to do that rather than ask the why question. Why do we want this in the first place? There are countless of times when I've heard DBAs say, oh, my manager heard this from one of the Microsoft conferences and they decided they want to implement this. It is tempting to just take on what your manager or what the business stakeholders said, because all we need to do now is just take action, accept whatever decision that they made, and just go on with it. But to rather practice asking meaningful questions. And, it's not about the question of asking what version of Windows, version of SQL Server, how many nodes in a available cluster, how many replicas in the AG, is it local HA only, is it both HA and D? It's easy to ask those questions because it's what most tech professionals are asking. Rather, learn how to ask meaningful business questions. Why do we need the solution in the first place? What is our recovery objective? How much is the business going to lose if, let's say, the database is offline for an hour? What is the impact to the business when this entire infrastructure goes offline for like hours or days? And in some cases, it's also tempting to define that for them. It is not our responsibility as tech professionals to define the numbers for the RPO and the RTO and the service level agreement. That is not our responsibility. Mm-hmm. It is the responsibility of the business stakeholders. However, it is our responsibility to ask those questions because we will end up managing them once it goes into production, right? So that's the first thing. If you want to avoid making these three biggest mistakes, first is condition yourself to ask meaningful questions, not technically driven, but business driven. And again, it takes some time. It took me a long time, I think more than a decade, trying to learn and refine it. I'm still learning how to ask those questions, because sometimes when people already made those decisions and they've already spent the time, the money for the licensing, the hardware, it is very difficult to change their decision unless we have a valid reason why you don't want to do that in the first place, right? So first is ask meaningful questions. Make sure that those questions will solve a real business problem. Okay, so that's the first one. And the second one falls under what I call the PPT manifesto, which I kind of coined way back in the early 2008 or 2009. The second one is to focus on processes and people first, rather than technology. The P stands for people, P stands for process. The technology should be secondary. The technology should not be the end goal, but rather a means to an end. And this opens up a ton of possibilities of providing a solution that does not have anything to do with technology. Okay. This is also an opportunity for you to start implementing automation, because now when you have defined and refined your processes, it makes it easy for you to pick and choose which portions of the process you can automate. Because if you're simply focusing on tech, right, and realizing that, this is something that we need to constantly do, what if you refine the process so that you no longer have to deal with it? What if you refine the process so that you can now focus on improving the process and use technology to address any issues with the process? And the most important part of that is people. I can count a number of times when people who do not have the right skills, the right expertise, and the right experience are being thrown into managing complex, high availability infrastructure. And it becomes a recipe for disaster, both for the individual and for the organization. I think in the last video I talked about the accident that I was in back in 2017. I would not allow any doctor to perform surgery on me if that doctor happens to be his or her first time doing an operation. Yet every day we are giving DBAs, sysadmins, or tech professionals the responsibility to manage a complex infrastructure that addresses high availability when they don't even have the right training, when they don't even have the right expertise. Somebody would say, sure, I'll pick up some of these things from the Microsoft documentation. Well, good luck with that. Trying to read the documentation, 45 pages of documentation, just to do one task makes you question your ability to do it, because now are you trying to do something, or are you trying to read the entire documentation? Like I said, it took me years to just simplify the documentation. And the thing is, when you just do it on your own, it's like my first point. If you try to do everything on your own, you are putting yourself in a lot of stress and a lot of pressure trying to perform when you could have just had the expertise of people who have done this, every day, who know the technology inside and out, and who have worked with the technology for years. Then I can understand, because a lot of people, again, fall into the trap of, what I mentioned in the first point, where they wanted to do everything on their own because they wanted to prove something. Again, you can either do that and waste a ton of time doing everything on your own, or get an expert help and get them involved to help you streamline your process, to make sure you get into the habit of asking the right business questions, so that you don't just fixate on the technology, but rather create a solution that would meet the business requirements while at the same time making life easy for you. Because, like I said, HA is not an individual sport. It is a team sport. And in order for you to do that, you need to have somebody guiding you every step of the way until you can finally be comfortable enough to do things on your own. Not do everything, right? I still don't recommend you doing everything on your own. Rather do things on your own until you can finally start automating stuff. And if that is something that you need, you can use this link on the screen to schedule a strategy session. And I can understand people are kind of hesitant because they're thinking, oh, well, I don't really know the questions that I need to ask. I don't even have any background working with high availability solutions, but then I'm being given this responsibility. Use that link on the screen, schedule a call with me, and let's have that conversation. The way I ask the questions will guide you through really figuring out what goals are you trying to accomplish and what it is that you want to achieve as you learn more about availability, to be confident enough to manage or even design an infrastructure on your own, or even find the right answers. Because sometimes, again, one misconfiguration could cause an outage without you even knowing. So use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session with me, and this will redirect you to my public calendar. We can pick and choose a time and date that works for you. 45 minutes to an hour worth of conversation is worth more than you trying to do your research on your own, you trying to figure things out on your own. And this is going to be more valuable than you wasting weeks or even months of trying to accumulate as much information as you possibly can. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have that talk. And I can guarantee you get more out of that 45 minutes to an hour worth of conversation. And if I can help, I will. And if not, I will steer you in the right direction that would help you achieve not just your own personal goals of trying to learn more about availability groups, but also knowing how to guide your organization on making the right decisions as to what technology really, what they really need to address their business requirement. Right? Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have that chat. Right. And that is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Join me again next week. Yes, next week, where I talk about another topic. And if this has been valuable to you, I highly recommend that you watch the recording again and again. Take as much notes as you possibly can. The tiny tidbits that you will learn from this would help you improve not just your operational processes or your day-to-day, but will also get you started to taking that step, achieving whatever it is that you want to achieve at work, right? I'll see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye.